Hi, I'm Chris Higa, product developer for Losi and the Mini LMT. Today, we're going to talk about all the option parts for the aluminum axle housings. You're basically going to need tools, your trusty 1.5 millimeter wrench and a 2.5 millimeter hex wrench. You can use the little multi-wrench, but it's easier if you have a 4 millimeter and a 5.5 millimeter nut driver, and then a pair of needle nose pliers, which will just come in handy. So to start, basically we're going to end up taking the axle housings off. So to make this a little easier today, since we actually didn't put the zip ties back onto our car, we're actually going to remove the body and cage completely and just get it out of the way. We've got the two screws back here on the cage that just hold the cage on, so we're going to remove those 2 screws. Kind of try and keep track of your screws to make sure you remember where stuff goes. It'll help you quite a bit when you have to put it back together. So since we didn't zip tie this back together quite yet, since we've been putting option parts on, we're able to easily get the body off, and you can kind of set that off to the side. Now we're actually going to remove the tires and wheels here. So this is a 5.5 millimeter nut driver to get in here, and you are just going to, well, let's grab the 5.5, not the 4 millimeter, and you can just remove the nut and we'll get the wheels to come off. If your battery is still in the truck, it's easy, same thing, you can remove that, just less stuff in your way. When you look at this, what's the easiest way to tackle this? We're going to do the front axle first. So the easiest way is actually to take the axle completely off the truck. So to do that, we're going to start by first removing the screw for the drag link here on the tie rod from the steering servo, so we can remove the steering servo. So you move that, and there's 2 screws here that hold the servo in. You're going to remove those 2 screws. So with those 2 screws out holding the servo, you can now disconnect the servo and the servo comes out complete. You don't need to remove the servo save or anything. That way you don't have to realign anything when you put it back together. So now that we have the servo off, we can remove the servo tray. So there's 3 screws in the servo tray, 1 in the front and 2 in the back. And same thing, just use your trusty 1.5 millimeter hex wrench. All right, so with these, I like to leave the screws inside the servo mount so that I don't forget which ones they are. Now we are going to remove the lower shock mounting screws. So 4 millimeter wrench, nut driver on the back, to make sure I keep the shock bolts in the same, but I put the screw and just lightly tighten the nut on that. That way I know I don't lose the lower shock mounting screw or get it confused with something else and mix them up. Now we're going to remove the 4-link bars and sway bars and the upper plate. So here, I think it's easiest if you flip the truck over, you can do the lower 4-link bars, and then it gives you access to the nuts that are on the sway bar links. So when we flip the truck over here, we can take these screws out. So with these screws, you got to make sure that you're putting a little bit of force on the head so that you make sure because the screw is in at, the wrench comes in at a little bit of an angle. So you got to make sure that you're actually putting quite a bit of pushing straight in on the head so you don't strip the head of the screw. So now we can take a pair of needle nose. So we're going to grab the nut here with a pair of needle nose. Come in. You can flip this back over. We're going to take out the 2 screws here for the upper 4-link bars. So now we can actually set the truck off to the side and start dismantling the axle so we can put in our cool aluminum housing and aluminum caster blocks and spindles. So we're going to continue breaking this axle down. You have 2 screws that hold the upper 4-link mount on, so we're going to remove those because we do have a cool aluminum counterpart to go to replace this one as well. As we keep dismantling, we're now going to take out the steering link. So there's 2 screws that remove the drag link. So when you take this tie rod out here, there is a little hat bushing into the tie rod. So you want to make sure that you take those out and set those aside because you're going to need those for when we replace them into the aluminum piece. We're going to take the spindles out. So the spindles, to get the spindles off, you remove the 2 kingpin screws. The kingpin screws are threaded, so they just thread into the spindle themselves. And the spindle screws are specific, so if you look at these, you see that there's only threads on the very top and the rest of it looks just like a pin. When you do that, you should be able to get the spindle and universal out. So we're going to take these out and set these to the side. So you got to wiggle this sometimes just a little bit to get there, to get these to come out, just because of the way the dog bone goes through in the universal. So there's sometimes a little bit of futzing with this to get it to come out, but it does come out, so you can get these out. All right, so now we have our spindle assemblies, and we'll be replacing those with a cool aluminum counterpart spindle. We're now going to take the caster blocks off. So the caster block here uses no, it still isn't one. It's a 2.5 millimeter screw, but it's still got, it's like these are a cap head. So there's 4 screws in these. One thing to note, when you're replacing the caster blocks, the steering stop is always to the back side. So if you notice here, this is the steering stop, the front side of the spindle doesn't have one. So when you go to replace these, you want to make sure that you're putting them in the correct orientation. But once you get these off, you repeat that on the other side, and we'll get the other caster block off. All right, so now we're getting down to the nitty-gritty of the axle housing here. We're going to continue to take these apart. We're going to remove the upper shock mounts and the lower 4-link mounts here. So each of those has 2 screws. So these lower mounts actually have, there is actually a left and a right. It's left front and right rear are the same, and right front and left rear are the same. Just by the way, the orientation of how they are keyed into the axle housing. So you'll see the shape, and the shape of that will dictate what position that it goes into in the axle housing. All right, we're getting down to the nitty-gritty of the axle housing. So we've got pretty much all the attachments off the axle housing. We can take the drive shaft off. So the drive shaft is a screw pin. So you're going to want to take that out. It is very, very small. So you want to be careful with that, not to lose it. All right, so now you have 8 screws that actually hold the axle housing together. 4 around the gear where the ring and pinion gear sit, 1 underneath the sway bar mounts, and then 1 outside closest to where the caster blocks and things mount. So you're going to want to remove all 8 of those screws. So one thing too you want to be careful of, there's should be a shim on the outside when you remove the drive shaft. So make sure that you don't lose that shim when you take this axle housing apart. So now that we've got all the screws out of it, you should be able to take the axle apart. So now you'll see the front half that's got, or the back half that's got the ring gear and the pinion gear here. And then you have the complete diff assembly that will come out. We're going to start, before we do this, we're actually going to assemble our spindles before we get to the cool axle housings. So we're taking the screw pin out. It's like the one for the universal, just longer. So the wheel hex comes out, and then you can take the axle out. Then we're going to pop the bearings out of these spindles. So the bearings come out, and you just set those aside. What you'll notice with these is one side of the spindle is tapped, one side is a through hole. So the spindle arms go to the front. So if you are trying to determine which side is which, if you see the side that's threaded and it's on the bottom, the spindle arm goes to the front, that's going to be the right side. So let's just double check these and make sure that we have a right and a left, and we do. Install your bearings into your spindle. Oops, bearing. And then you're going to take your axle. The universal goes through. Your wheel hex. And then the screw pin. So you want to be careful with these screw pins because you can break them if you get crazy and try to over tighten them. Now that these are assembled, I'm putting these off to the side, but I'm going to put them so when I look at them left and right, so that when I grab them to assemble them into the axle, I'm not messing with it too much. So now we're going to start to assemble the axle housing. So we're taking our aluminum axle housing here, and we're going to install the bearings and the pinion gear. And when we do this, we're going to make sure we put the same shims in that we did on the outside. So there's a shim on the outside of the universal. So we're going to put that same shim back out there. On the pinion gear, there is a flat spot. It is D-shaped. If you look at the universal, it is also D-shaped. So it only goes on one way. And then with this, we'll put the screw pin back in. Now we're going to put the differential back in. If you zoom in close to this axle housing, there's some writing in there, and it's got an arrow, and it tells you what side to put the ring gear on, because you can put the ring gear in backwards, and then you'll have, if you do that, your axles will definitely, the wheels will spin the opposite direction. It goes in this orientation, okay? that assures that it's going to spin the correct direction with the transmission and the current motor setup. But this is where you want to grease, put a little bit of grease on the ring and pinions to make it for durability. We sell a it's really tacky, it's a clear diff grease for these differentials. Because the differentials are open, they're not completely sealed. You can't fill them with any type of fluid. So we're using a very tacky grease when we're assembling these diffs. So if you feel like your diff is starting to freewheel quite a bit and you want to tighten it up a little bit, when you pull the diff apart, you can now pack the diff with that super tacky grease. So now we're going to take the front and rear housings and we're going to start to reassemble. So we're going to start with the 4 cap head screws around the 3rd member. And we're going to start by just putting those in. So we'll snug those up. Then we're going to take the 4 flathead screws that we removed and we're going to put those in. So the 2 on the outside of the axle housing and the 2 that go underneath where the 4-link bar, where the sway bars mount. All right, so those are all in now. So our axle housing is starting to come together to look like an axle housing. So now we're going to we can remount our upper shock mounts. And those are the 2 screws. All right, so now we're going to do the lower shock mounts. So the lower shock mounts we talked about is you're having to match up the angle of these with the location. So you'll reuse the screws out of the original mounts. Okay, so now we're going to go to mounting the caster blocks that we talked about. So remember we said that the stops on the caster block go to the back of the axle housing. When we put these on, you can see that the stop's going to be here to the back of the axle housing. Then we're going to find our cap head screws here and get these all installed. All right, so now we've got the caster block on, the mounts are in, so now we're going to put our spindles in. So you want to make sure, remember, that the threaded side is on the bottom and that the arms go to the front. All right, so now we're going to get the other side. We can get the other side in, and we're going to put the kingpins in. All right, so then we're going to just check, make sure you're going to take your drive shaft, spin it, make sure the differential works, you feel everything is connected, so that way you know that now the axle is, for the most part, assembled. But now we're going to take our Tierod here. So remember we took the bushings, we took the little hat bushings out of the original one. Those are going to go, you can see that there's a recess and flat for these bushings to go into, so you're going to make sure these bushings go square into that and they're flat, because if they're not seated in there properly, there's a good chance that you're going to get a bind in the steering rack here. So we're going to put the rod into the spindle, and we're going to come and thread this through. All right, so now that our axle is almost completely assembled, we're actually going to attach it back to the truck. And the lower 4-link bars, this is why we left that upper 4-link mount off right now, because it just gives us easier access to the screw for this sway bar mount. All right, so now we got those in, sway bar mounts in. You can line up the drive shaft here. Now we're going to put the lower 4-link bolts in. But now we're going to put this upper 4-link mount back on. So when we put this upper 4-link bar on, first you got to also make sure that the 4-link bars are up where they're supposed to be. So we'll put these screws now in. And the reason we did this, you can see here where the sway bar link mounts are. It's real close to this mount. So if we're taking all this stuff apart right now, it was easier to leave this mount off for right now, so to mount the sway bars. Make sure your 4-link bars are up there. Get the drive shaft connected. So the easiest one is, once you get it to this point, is to sit it flat on the table. So then it makes it easier to kind of, it holds the drive shaft in place. Then you can work to get these upper 4-link bars mounted and get the screw in. Because once you get one side in, then the other one goes in pretty easy. Then we're going to take our servo mount, and we're going to mount our servo mount back in once we got all the 4-link bars attached. And when you do this, you want to make sure that your sway bars don't end up falling down. Make sure that they're in the correct position here. We can now mount, we can go back and mount our shocks. All right, we're starting to look like a truck again. Now we can reinstall our servo. So you want to connect your servo back. Make sure you match up the color of the wires. The black and the brown here are what are considered your negative wires. We're almost back together with the front end, and then we get to do it all over again for the rear axle. But the rear axle doesn't have quite as many parts in it, and it does go a little bit quicker. All right, so we're like halfway, well, we're more than halfway there. So now, front end is all assembled. Aluminum axle housing, aluminum spindle carrier, the drag link, and the tie rod. So we're on our way. All right, we're now moving on to the back of the truck, but to save a little bit of time, the process to actually build the axle is the same as the front, minus like the spindles and things like that. So we're going to focus this part of the video on putting the rear lockouts on, so you can just get those things changed. And if you want to actually build the full aluminum axle housing, you can reference the front part of this video. So for the rear axle housings, we're going to take the wheel hexes off first, because that's going to give us access to the screws that actually hold the lockouts in. And the wheel hex is off. And then that gives you access to the 4 long screws here. So we're going to take these 4 out. And with the 0 degree rear lockouts, it doesn't matter, they're not necessarily side specific. When we do release the 3 degree lockouts, those will be side specific because they will create toe in. So if you do put them on and you put them on backwards, your car's gonna either have crazy toe out or it'll crab walk. But they will all be labeled, you know, left, right, front, rear. So you have those far. You can actually leave the dog bone in if you're just changing it on the plastic axle housing. And you're gonna wanna pull the 4 long screws out. And now we're going to pull the axle out and we're gonna get the bearing out here. And then you have your aluminum counterpart. As a, you know, they look very similar. They have a key marking here that you see, and that key's front to back on the axle housing. So we'll put our bearings back in and put our axle housing in, and then you're going to make sure that you key the knock here to the mark on the axle housing itself. There it goes. And then we're going to put the 4 screws back in. All right, so with that in, then we're going to reinstall our wheel hex and our wheel hex pin. The screw pin goes through. Screw down just till it gets snug. Then repeat the process on the other side. All right, so now you can see the aluminum lockouts on the rear axle. Like I said, if you wanted to do the full axle housing change, the assembly itself is the same as the front axle, and you can reference the prior video. But we just wanted to show you how to get the axle lockouts on, and that they do also, like I said, all these parts are compatible with the original plastic composite housing, so you don't have to upgrade everything. You can upgrade as you want to go. If you want to learn more tips and tricks about the Mini LMT, you can check Losi's YouTube channel. Follow up for more videos there. We'll see you on the next one.